Michelle, but it felt to me urgent to start with the crisis in diplomacy that we're all watching play out across the front pages right now, by which I refer to relations between the US and Iran. I will share one quick story and then hand it over to y'all. On the plane on the way in today from DC, I was reading the paper, and a story caught my eye because it was so relevant to what we're here to talk about tonight. And out of that story, it was two particular sentences that caught my eye. So I've actually brought it, and if you'll indulge me for 1 second, I'm just going to set the stage by sharing this. This is the New York Times today, detailing the newest sanctions the US has just added against Iran, and pointing out that among those sanctions are ones that will specifically target Iran's foreign minister, Zarif. And the article says this: Mr. Zarif was educated in the United States, and within the Iranian political system, he's considered a moderate, the kind of figure hardliners might seek to cast out and previous American administrations had sought to cultivate. As foreign minister, he would also be the main conduit for any negotiations with Tehran. This struck me because of what it tells us about the way that the US is carrying itself on the world stage today, that at a moment where diplomacy would seem to be desperately needed, the US has sanctioned the guy, maybe the one guy in Iran who is capable of delivering a diplomatic off-ramp to this situation. So Bill Burns, I'll throw that to you. What should we make of this?
Well, first, it's great to be with all of you. Great to be with Mary Louise and George, whose book I really enjoyed. So the nice uplifting subject of Iran. I mean, I spent 3.5 decades.
The night will get better, don't worry.
Yeah, no, I spent 3.5 decades as an American diplomat, and Iran was an issue that sort of hung over a good bit of it. I took the examination for the Foreign Service in London in November of 1979, the same week that our embassy was overrun by Iranians, and my future colleagues as diplomats were taken hostage. And then much later in my career, I led the secret talks with the Iranians through all of 2013 on the nuclear issue that helped ultimately produce the comprehensive nuclear agreement. My concern is pretty straightforward about what's happening today. I mean, I don't think the United States has a coherent strategy. I think we're pursuing an approach, at least, which people in the administration call coercive diplomacy, but it's all coercion and no diplomacy. And designating or sanctioning the chief diplomat of Iran is a pretty good illustration of that. And I think the danger of that approach is pretty obvious right now. We're boxing ourselves into a situation in which collisions, whether inadvertent or advertent ones, become more and more likely over time, and where hardliners, both in Tehran and in Washington, and there's no shortage in either capital these days, become kind of mutual enablers, and you end up going up a very unsteady escalatory ladder very quickly. So I know the president says he's not interested in another Middle East war. The Iranian leadership says the same thing. But the Middle East, in my experience over the years, and I spent about half my career working on Middle East issues or working in the Middle East, is the land of unintended consequences. And I fear right now we're sliding toward collisions that aren't going to end well for anybody.
George, let me let you jump in here. Is it clear to you that the US wants a diplomatic off-ramp from where things are headed in the Gulf?
First, it's good to be with you and with Bill, and I would recommend Bill's book, The Back Channel, to everyone here if you really want to know how diplomacy works, what diplomats do. He was everywhere that mattered. He was like Zelig during his career, from the end of the Cold War to the Middle East, Russia, and the war in Iraq, and onward to Iran. So it's a book that gives you both a great history of American diplomacy since the 70s and also a personal view of what it's like to be a diplomat. I think that, as far as I can tell, I've never spoken to the man. President Trump thinks that he wants to engage in diplomacy, and he seems to get kind of energized by these summit meetings, at least with the dictator of North Korea, with Kim Jong-un. The problem is the view of diplomacy seems to be we coerce people into doing what we want them to do. And then we talk to them, and they, by the time we reach that point, have been so bludgeoned by our coercion that they're going to yield. And what Bill's book shows is that diplomacy is always, in some ways, dissatisfying, because it's by definition about compromise, about starting with high demands and maximalist objectives, and then figuring out where you're willing to settle, because you will have to settle unless you're ready to go to war.
Right, but isn't one of the definitions of successful diplomacy is both sides walk away thinking we won?
Or we lost, but which can also be a success.
Parity would be it.
And I think all too often in diplomacy, the reality is you're managing problems, not so much solving them. I mean, you know, what Richard Holbrooke did in Dayton was about managing a problem. It was stopping a war. What we did in the Iranian nuclear agreement was not a perfect agreement, but perfect is rarely on the menu in diplomacy, in my experience. It was the best of the available alternatives for preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. It still left lots of other Iranian actions which threatened our interests and threatened the interests of our friends, but at least it removed the most imminent risk that we face.
And I think that deal is the perfect example of separating those who understand diplomacy as always involving something short of what you would ultimately want, and those who think diplomacy is how you get what you want, everything you want. Because the opposition to that deal, which ended up destroying it once Trump became president, was always based on the fallacy that they could get something better, as if you guys had just failed to see some obvious...
I wish we had thought of that.
Yeah. And in fact, there was not a better deal to be had, and this was a way to maybe delay a reckoning by 10 or 15 years, and meanwhile have the most intrusive inspections in the history of nuclear energy. So there's a kind of mindset that thinks you can always do better, and that mindset doesn't take into account the thinking of the other side. And I think Bill's career shows that what good diplomats can do is get into the skin of the person on the other side of the table, not in order to sympathize with them, but just in order to understand.
And let me take us back just a few years before the nuclear deal and make this concrete. Because you, Bill, are one of the very few Americans who actually, as you nodded to, have direct experience negotiating with the Iranians.
That's where I got most
How
of my
did that come
gray
to
hair.
be? Tell us the story.
Sorry?
Tell us the story. How did it come to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, President Obama set out at the beginning of his first term to both test the proposition that you could negotiate directly with the Iranians. But, you know, what I think people didn't understand well at the time was that this was also an investment. If they proved unable to negotiate seriously, it was an investment in building a serious international coalition of countries. So 2009, we engaged, I met directly with the Iranians. They weren't at that time prepared to negotiate seriously. We used that as an investment to build a fair amount of economic and political pressure. By the beginning of 2013, the value of their currency had dropped by 50%. Their oil exports had dropped by 50% as well. The mind of the Iranian leadership was focused. But it wasn't pressure for its own sake. It was pressure aimed at a practical end. And then we were prepared to negotiate directly with the Iranians, which we did secretly. 9 or 10 sessions, most of them in Oman on the Arabian Sea.
Where do you meet? I mean, just take us in the
we
room.
met
Is it
in
a hotel?
we met in a Omani military officers' retreat right on the Arabian Sea, which they had very politely vacated for our use. The temperature outside was about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So there was not a whole lot else to do but talk to the Iranians.
You had air conditioning, right?
We had air conditioning, right, but there wasn't a lot of incentive to go walk on the beach. But, I think, we made relatively rapid progress because the Iranians, this is after President Rouhani was elected and Zarif became the foreign minister, wanted to put points on the board. They were feeling economic pressure. And so we were able to produce an interim agreement by the end of November of 2013 which was actually in many ways a better deal for us than it was for them. It froze their nuclear program. It rolled it back in some important respects. As George suggested, it introduced some really tight verification and monitoring procedures, and all in return for very limited sanctions relief. We preserved the bulk of that leverage for the later comprehensive talks that Secretary Kerry led.
To your knowledge, is anything at all like that happening now? Anything back channel?
No, to the best of my knowledge. I mean, we're trying to do diplomacy without talking to Iranians.
George, I want to spin this out into a hypothetical, because you wrote the book, as I just said, on Richard Holbrooke. And your book begins in Vietnam, which is where his foreign policy career began, but comes all the way up through wars still unfolding today in Afghanistan and Iraq. What would Dick Holbrooke do? Or I mean, let me put it this way. What would the most ambitious, determined, experienced diplomat in current company accepted, in U.S., how would he handle this? I mean, what are the possibilities for diplomacy with Iran?
He tried to talk to the Iranians in 2009, at the beginning of his service under President Obama as the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He approached an Iranian diplomat at a meeting, I think in The Hague, at a conference. And it was sort of one of these scripted, unscripted meetings. The Iranian was taken by surprise because he didn't know what was going to happen. Holbrooke tried to make small talk about the architecture of Isfahan, which was his way of letting the Iranian know that he'd been in his country, and then said, we must stay in touch. And that was the last time Holbrooke talked to an Iranian, because it sort of blew up, and I think the White House hadn't really been informed, and this was the beginning of a very unhappy last 2 years of his career and his life, when he, in the view of Obama and his aides, went rogue over and over again and lost the trust of the president, and really lost his ability to function. So his career ended under a president whose trust he desperately wanted, and who basically did not like him, did not want to be in the same room with him. That's a bit of another story, but it's the way Holbrooke's life ended. And so it's hard for me to imagine Holbrooke in the middle of this, since I saw and wrote his career as a trajectory that had a decline. His own abilities declined, and his feel for the people around him, especially the president, failed him. But I think if he were in his prime, he would probably not look all that different from John Kerry. Super active. I can do all of this. I want to be involved in all these things. We can get it done if we keep talking to them. Let's go back to Geneva one more time and meet with the Syrians and meet with the Iranians. That he would do it in a much more histrionic, attention-getting, and possibly brutal way. But that supreme confidence in himself and in the U.S. as the solver of problems never deserted him. So my guess is, if you want to know what Holbrooke would be doing, maybe look at what Kerry did in his. Do you think that's true, Bill?
I do. Yeah, no, I think that's very likely.
You're making me wonder about a broader question, which is there room in U.S. foreign policy today for a character like Holbrooke? And the reason I ask is, as you both would know better than I, if you are going to send somebody in to solve the genocide in Bosnia and former Yugoslavia, or to try to sort out Afghanistan and Pakistan, that only has a shred of a chance of success if that person is seen to be carrying the word and carrying the weight of the president. And I'm struggling to think of anybody in this current administration who has that authority. It's not the way this president operates.
Well, I think Holbrooke was a figure from a different era. I don't know that I think that the government has become more constrained. The roles that people play are more straitjacketed. Going rogue, going off script, tossing out your talking points, ignoring your emails, being disconnected from main state, all of those things I think are pretty hard to do now and maintain a a job and a career, not just in the State Department, but in government generally. You know, the atmosphere in government is terror of saying the wrong thing, of getting on cable news and for the wrong reason. There's a caution that Holbrooke, of course, was the opposite of, and that both enraged his colleagues, made enemies right and left, and also, I think, made him a brilliant diplomat at the key moments, especially in Dayton and on Bosnia. I don't know, do you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, in general, I absolutely agree, George. I mean, I think there are exceptions. And in a way, the Iranian secret talks through 2013 were such an exception. I mean, I remember one instance where we were in the White House situation with President Obama, and Jake Sullivan, who was, my closest collaborator in the secret nuclear talks, and I, at the end of the meeting, the president called us over and said, basically, I trust you guys, don't screw it up. Now, that was the entirety of his instruction to us, going into, what was a crucial round of the secret talks. That's one of those moments when you wish you had 14 pages of single-spaced, instructions that tell you to turn left, turn right. So it's still possible, I think, in this day and age to, for good diplomats to have some leeway and not to be too bound by their instructions. But Washington's changed a lot over time, too. I mean, it's a much more polarized city, and you're much more likely to get second-guessed than I think in some earlier eras.
I had the pleasure of interviewing you, Bill, 2-3 weeks ago about your book, and I asked a question that I want to loop back to. I asked, in a word, what is the state of U.S. influence in the world? What is the state of U.S. diplomacy? Do you remember what you told me?
No, I can think of synonyms, but...
You said hollowed out, which is 2 words, but we'll give it to you.
Yeah, right. No, I think the State Department as an institution is hollowed out today. You can measure that in tangible terms. I mean, for 3 years in a row, the White House has tried to cut the budget of the State Department by about 30% each year. Applications to join the U.S. Foreign Service, what Richard Holbrooke joined in 1962 and I did in 1982, are down by about 40% after 20 years in which they rose every year. The painfully slow progress that we made to create a diplomatic service that was more diverse, that looked like the society we represented, has been put into reverse. There's a pernicious practice today to go after individual career diplomats or civil servants who happen to work on controversial issues in the last administration. So those are the tangible indicators, along with a lot of, huge unprecedented number of senior vacancies in the State Department itself and some of our biggest embassies overseas. Then you have the intangibles, like when President Trump was asked about a year and a half ago whether he was concerned about all those senior vacancies. He said, not really, because I'm the only one who matters. That's diplomacy as an exercise in narcissism, not the diplomacy I learned from George H.W. Bush and Secretary Baker a long time ago.
George, do you want to give me a word?
I mean, everything I hear from Foreign Service officers that I know is that they're barely hanging in there, or they've left, or they're leaving.
That's based on reporting you've done, talking
just
to people there.
knowing diplomats from years of reporting, but these are private conversations. But and that the building is weirdly, eerily sort of quiet, and that was maybe more true under Tillerson than under Pompeo, who, with some maybe excessive fanfare, tried to restore morale, but it's dismal. And it's hard to imagine a really thoughtful, ambitious, creative young person thinking, where do I want to make a difference? I think I'm going to join the State Department. That just doesn't seem any... In '62, when Holbrooke graduated from Brown, he had 2 ambitions, either to become the editor of the New York Times or to become the Secretary of State. So there was here were the categories for what you could do to become a great man, which is what he absolutely wanted. You could either become a politician, which he didn't quite have, you could be a great athlete or a great writer, or you could be a statesman. That was one of the available categories of glory and honor and ambition. And I don't think that is really true today for young people. There are, of course, very good young people who are still taking the exam and going to the Foreign Service, but I don't think it has that allure that it did in Holbrook's day or in Bill's day during the late years of the Cold War.
All right, well, let me push you both on this. It sounds as though you are in agreement that there is a decline in...
Well, that's a longer decline, but I
Right.
think then
That
it has
predates-
plummeted.
Yeah.
Let's go like this and then like that in the last 3 years.
Well, so that prompts two related questions. Was it inevitable, no matter who had won in 2016, no matter who wins in 2020? Is it reversible, no matter who wins in 2020?
Listen, we're in a new era now, and so in that sense, it was inevitable that whomever was elected in 2016 was going to have to adjust American foreign policy. We're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block, with the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia. There are huge consequential issues like climate change and the revolution in technology that are well beyond the capacity of any one country, even a country as powerful as the United States, to deal with. I still think the United States has a better hand to play than any of our major rivals, not just because of our military and economic leverage, but also because of our capacity to draw on alliances, to mobilize coalitions of countries. That's what diplomacy is about. And what I worry about today is that we're corroding that tool of diplomacy and squandering that asset. So I still think the United States has a window before it, stretching out over the next decade or two, when we can help reshape order before it gets reshaped for us by the rise of other countries and other events. I still think it's possible to renew American diplomacy, but we're digging a pretty deep hole for ourselves today. And my concern is we'll eventually stop digging, but when we climb back to the top of the hole, we're going to look out on a landscape that's hardened against our interests and in some ways against our values.
I asked a German diplomat in Washington, will you accept us back? After this is over and we come to you and say, that was a mistake, we care about NATO, we care about our alliances, the transatlantic alliance is central to our foreign policy. He said, if it's a one-term Trump presidency, yes, but if it's 2 terms, there will be a permanent change. There will not be a complete recovery from it, because that will have created such a long period of distrust and alienation and friction that you just can't turn the clock back if it goes on for that long.
I have one follow-up, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from all of you, so get your questions ready. But let me ask this, to play devil's advocate. If a member of the Trump administration were sitting here, if Mike Pompeo wandered in that door and came and joined us on this stage, he might well say, first of all, he can't wander in the door and join us on stage because he's out conducting diplomacy throughout the Middle East, trying to build a coalition to confront Tehran. And secondly, he might argue, look, we are exerting American influence overseas through military channels, through covert channels, cyber, intel, through economic sanctions. We are just finding different ways for America to defend its best interests overseas. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think there are some places where I think, President Trump is right to push. He's right to push against predatory Chinese trade and investment practices, where I think he's wrong in the way in which he goes about doing it. Logically, you'd want to make common cause with other countries, the European Union, Japan, who share those same concerns, rather than start second and third front trade conflicts with them. He's right to push some NATO partners to spend more on defense. He's not the first president to do that, but he's right to push as hard as he has. Where I think he's wrong, and where there's a real departure from, for all the mistakes we made over the years, Republicans and Democrats, there was a sense of enlightened self-interest which animated, American foreign policy. In other words, the sense that our self-interest as a country was best served by kind of broadening the number of countries who shared those basic interests. And I think what's happening today is turning that on its head, a lot more about the self part than the enlightened part. And that, I think, has an opportunity cost at a moment when the landscape is in the process of transformation. This is one of those plastic moments that comes along once or twice a century.
Can you give a quick example just to make that tangible?
In which they're missing the opportunities? Yeah, I mean, to come back to European partners as well. I mean, I was in Germany 2 months ago, and there was a poll done that asked Germans, which foreign leaders do you trust? 24% trusted President Trump in the United States, 36% trusted Vladimir Putin in Russia. That's the kind of thing that has a corrosive impact over time, because allies start to hedge, just as adversaries take advantage.
And it also feels like exactly the wrong balance of tools for this moment, because we are not an ascendant power. No. We are not, this is not 1990, when suddenly we find ourselves without the rival we've had for decades. We are now, as Bill said, among many competitors with a declining relative power, with a jaded public, with an exhausted 2 decades of war that involved overreach and expense of resources and of lives that we now regret. That's exactly when we need to figure out how can we continue or regain influence around the world. And it is not going to be with coercion alone, or even mainly with coercion, because that's just not the moment in history that we're in. In my travels, I find people are asking not, why don't you Americans take care of your own problems? That the usual Yankee go home. It's been, where are you? I was in Bosnia a couple months ago, and everyone, including Bosnian Serbs, was saying, you've disappeared. You don't have a strong presence. You're not involved in our politics the way you've been, and the Russians are filling the vacuum. And what they wanted from us was, for example, for our diplomats to express some concern for protesters in the Serbian city of Banja Luka, who were the first real civil unrest against a dictatorial Bosnian Serb government of Milorad Dodik. Instead, the Americans are missing. And I think what would be a multiplier of our influence is if we remember that there are the countries, like small countries that feel squeezed between powers in their own region, turn to us for an example and for help and understanding in figuring out what their interests are, what their predicament is, and how can we help them in a way that serves our own interests. If we're not thinking in that way, then we are contracting our influence, because that's the point in history, I think, that we've reached.
No, and the only thing I'd add, George, is that, it's those alliances and our capacity to mobilize coalitions of countries that sets us apart today from lonelier powers like China and Russia. So we're squandering what is really a unique asset for the United States at this moment of transformation.
Right, so we will become one of many powers, each pursuing in a kind of a brutal way its own narrowly defined self-interest, which means we're essentially the North American version of the other powers, China and Russia. And I don't think that's how we expand our influence around the world.
And do you see something very different unfolding now than, your book chronicles extensively the early days of American absence from all the horrors unfolding as Yugoslavia ate itself alive and Bosnia fell apart, and they were saying, where are you? Where are you? And the U.S. wasn't there.
Right, and as brilliant as the foreign policy of the first President Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker were, I think they made a terrible mistake in thinking a civil war in places whose names we can't pronounce. We don't have a dog in that fight, because that war really nearly tore apart not just the Balkans, but NATO.
All right, questions. We have 2 mics that are going to make their way around. I will call on you if you can make your question short and make it an actual question. That will let me fit in many more and get to as many of you as we can. I see a lady right here in orange. And if you could just wait till the mic makes its way to you so we can all hear you. Hi.
Hello, I just have a question. Do you have any predictions or hopes for the outcome of the upcoming conference in Japan this weekend, just regarding Trump's past trends of erratic and unpredictable behavior when meeting with foreign dignitaries?
Well, it'd be worth the price of admission, because the president, clearly has considerable distaste for those kind of multilateral meetings. What'll be most interesting are his meetings with President Xi of China, given the trade conflict between the U.S. and China. And there I would bet that, the two of them are going to strike a positive note and direct their negotiators to, make progress towards some kind of a trade agreement before the end of the year. He's also going to meet with Vladimir Putin, which is, always a fascinating experience. Remember when he met last summer in Helsinki with Putin, and then did, a press conference afterwards where in an effort to ingratiate himself with Putin, he essentially threw 17 U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies under the bus. And I think if you had had a cartoon balloon coming out of Putin's head on that stage, it would have said, what an easy mark. Because from his point of view, efforts to ingratiate yourself are a sign of weakness and manipulability as well. So it'd be interesting to see the big meeting, but I think more interesting to see some of those big meetings between President Trump and the Russian and Chinese counterparts.
I was in that room in Helsinki at that moment when Putin and Trump.
Did you gasp?
There was an audible gasp from both sides of the room. You could hear the simultaneous translation is going. So the Russians, they had the American White House press corps on one side of the room, and the Russians on the other, and then all the other nationalities behind us. I think the Finns were somewhere in there. So you heard the gasp on the American side of the room, and then the translation came out, and then you heard it echoed 10 seconds later on the other. Yeah. You were going to add on.
I have no predictions, but it does seem this is how Trump diplomacy works. It's all personalized. It's all the guy at the top because he doesn't need assistant secretaries of state. He's going to make it up on the spot, and you end up with Helsinki, and maybe there'll be something equivalent in Tokyo.
We shall see. Another question. Gentleman in the front row, and the mic's making its way to you. Just here.
Thank you. Question for Ambassador Burns, Your Excellency.
No, I dropped those ears a long time ago, don't worry.
What can former ambassadors, such as yourself, teach the current American business leaders that operate worldwide about the current state of things and how they should maybe be doing things? Leaders that have a presence, influence, and depend on the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, it's tough terrain to navigate these days too, because normally you'd want to encourage the sort of closest partnership you can. When I was an ambassador overseas, I spent probably a third of my time working in support of American businesses or trying to help create a more level playing field for them and competing in foreign markets as well. And I think these days there are a lot of good ambassadors who try to do that as well, but it's just a much more confusing, contested, complicated terrain today as well. I think the onset of, tariff wars complicates things further because you get caught in the crossfire there. I think the, gradual erosion of a lot of the big international financial institutions and uncertainty about their future makes it complicated as well. But at the end of the day, in business as in diplomacy, there's no alternative to understanding the terrain you're trying to navigate, foreign business climates, building personal relationships, which is what diplomats do as well. And for all the advances in technology, business overseas, just like diplomacy, is still, about human interactions as well. And so in that sense, it puts even more of a premium given all the confusion around you and building those kind of personal relationships.
Let's see. We'll take one over here and then one over here. Just here. Forwards, back. Blue shirt.
It wasn't that long ago that people talked about soft power a lot, which was America with its culture and its leadership in business and even how we govern our economy was viewed admiringly by the rest of the world. What's the state of that soft power now? Does it still matter? Is it still there? And is it something that we can leverage for diplomatic purposes?
I mean, right now it looks like our model is not being copied worldwide, to say the least. In fact, we're copying other people's models for the worse, I think. It was always maybe a little bit overstated because national interests have a kind of hard edge to them that can maybe be eased along by talking, by cultural exchanges, by business investments, by student exchanges, all the things that expose people to the culture and society of another country. But in the end, it's happening at a lower level, I think, than what most diplomacy is about, which is really about national interest and how that's defined. It's the big question is how you define it.
No, the only thing I'd add, because I agree with George, is that I always found in all the years I worked overseas representing our country, is you get a lot farther through the power of our example than you do through the power of our preaching. And right now our example is pretty lousy. And that has practical value in promoting American influence overseas as well. When we check our values at the door in dealing with authoritarian regimes, whether it's Russia or China or Saudi Arabia today, it comes at a cost sometimes too. Because what has appealed to lots of people overseas about our society, at our best, and we're not always at our best, is the sense of possibility and mobility that we've demonstrated our best. And when we have such a hard time dealing with immigration challenges and create such a poisonous atmosphere around those kind of issues, when we indulge, a lot of autocrats overseas, and I'm not trying to suggest we had a pristine record in all the administrations that I worked in. We oftentimes got those trade-offs wrong to our later regret. But today, I think all too often, we do kind of check our values at the door. We don't raise our voices over, the murder of a Saudi journalist at a Saudi diplomatic facility in Istanbul. And those are the kind of things that not only, I think, are morally questionable, but do us a lot of practical damage too, because the power of our example does matter. And that's what a lot of people expect of the United States, when they look at American power overseas.
Yeah, I was on that trip to Bosnia that I took recently. A young journalist said to me, when your president calls you the enemy of the people, how do you think that affects us when we're trying to get our own heavy-handed authorities to allow us to function as journalists? We cannot point to the United States and say, this is the model you should follow. And the United States can't step forward. How's the ambassador in Sarajevo going to reprimand the authorities in some provincial city for jailing journalists when the President of the United States is calling them the enemy of the American people? It has a real effect.
It does have an effect. I will say, traveling last year in China and Russia and North Korea, places where you need to take certain precautions, but places where I always have thought, as long as I conduct myself prudently, if I had a real problem, like somebody at the State Department would help me get out of here. They would have my back as an American citizen. And I have had cause to think very carefully about that, going to those places recently. But where you have a question over here, but just quickly, you mentioned Saudi journalist being killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And I just don't want us to leave tonight before touching on, I don't know if y'all saw the pictures coming out of Saudi Arabia this week. Secretary of State Pompeo smiling and having snacks with Mohammed bin Salman. Did that bother you in any way? Or if you're going to practice diplomacy, you don't always get to pick who you are practicing it with, and you got to sit down and talk to somebody who's a U.S. ally.
In your book, you're shaking hands with Bashar al-Assad. You're shaking, this is sort of, there are things you have to do.
Gaddafi, surely the most peculiar foreign leader I ever dealt with. And I dealt with Gaddafi in another set of secret talks when we were basically pushing him out of the business of terrorism and giving up his nuclear program. And all the hours and hours that I spent with Gaddafi, I never forgot the blood that was on his hands. When his agents destroyed Pan Am 103 and killed 270 innocent people in December of 1988, One of the passengers on that plane was a friend of mine, a CIA officer, was a former colleague at my first post in the Middle East, who was coming home from Beirut for Christmas to see his wife and 2 young daughters. So, there are some really complicated trade-offs in doing diplomacy. I think the mistake is not to be naive about those trade-offs, but it's to think that it's somehow a good thing, it somehow helps preserve a healthy relationship with an autocratic regime to give them a pass on these issues. You need to try as best we can to create two-way streets, because that's an investment in a healthier relationship over time and a healthier partner, because authoritarian regimes that don't address those kind of issues tend to become more brittle over time and ultimately break. That was part of the lesson of the Arab Spring, I think.
Can I ask you, Bill, in 2009, when you were beginning the first talks, secret talks with Iranians, there was an uprising in Iran over the probably fraudulent elections of June 2009. Right. Millions of people in the streets, hundreds of them killed, thousands thrown in prison, a really significant moment of potential opening that was crushed. And President Obama very carefully said very little about it and was criticized. What do you think about the position? Because obviously he did not want to begin his overture with a public reprimand of the regime. So what? I
think two things. I think those first couple of weeks during the the uprising, after the fraudulent elections in the summer of 2009 in Iran, we made a mistake by not speaking out more forcefully then. The second thing I'd say, though, is that the reason I think that the White House, that all of us initially were more mute than we should have been, had less to do with, concern about jeopardizing nuclear talks and more a concern about actually jeopardizing the Green Movement protesters, because the message we were hearing from them was, don't wrap us publicly in American embrace. That's going to allow the regime to say, see, all these people are American stooges and they're put out in the street by the United States. I think we were probably wrong. I think we probably should have just taken the risk and spoken out, more forcefully in public. But honestly, at the time, that was the bigger factor, I think, in the president's mind.
And just yes or no, would you have sat down, shaken hands, smiled for the cameras this week with Mohammed bin Salman?
No.
No. Mistake, you think?
No, I think it's not a mistake to engage. He's the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia right now. As much as we may be repulsed by some of the actions of that regime, I think there are other ways in which we have to deal with it. But I wouldn't have smiled for the cameras, and B, I think it's important to raise those concerns directly with him in private and then publicly as well.
All right, we had a couple of hands over here. Yes, in blue in the second row right here.
Thank you. Ambassador Burns, in your book, The Back Channel, you talk both about the long game, diplomatic strategy, as well as the short game. So if you were in charge of diplomacy today for the United States, what would be the one or two long game issues you would be focusing on and the few short game issues you would be focusing on?
I think the long game issues we've talked a little bit about. Climate change, I think, is the single biggest existential threat out there for human society. So I think it was a huge mistake to bail out of the Paris Climate Treaty, and that's a long game issue that we need to pay attention to. I think the return of great power rivalry with China and Russia is a hugely important issue, and that's something that's going to require, that's the big challenge of statecraft, is how do you manage what oftentimes are adversarial relationships with China and Russia, but do it in a way which, identifies some areas in which you can cooperate, or at least in which you can manage the dangers of things, spilling into outright permanent state of confrontation as well. Short game issues, I just think, we're squandering assets with allies, even in North America. It takes a special kind of diplomacy to piss off the Canadians, and that's what we've managed to do. North America, Canada, and Mexico ought to be our kind of natural strategic home base, and we ought to pay more creative and more positive attention to those relationships as well.
Yes, sir, right here in the gray jacket. Here comes the mic.
Thank you. Ambassador Burns, I had a question as far as Saudi Arabia marching towards nuclear capabilities with the help of China, as well as kind of President Trump being mute on the topic, and what impact will that have if they have a nuclear weapon and on the region long term?
Well, I mean, I think, the last thing the Middle East needs is, given all of its fragilities and insecurities, is a nuclear arms race. And that's, a large part of the reason that we, negotiated so hard to produce the Iranian nuclear agreement, because I think it helped ensure, at least for the foreseeable future, that kind of an arms race. And I think, part of the problem today, too, in dealing with North Korea as well in another part of the world, and the exchange of love letters is, the lesson that a lot of people draw from that is North Korea is a nuclear armed state today. Even as, we're exchanging excellent letters back and forth, North Korea is actually expanding its nuclear arsenal as well. So, if you're the Iranians or the Saudis or others, over time, one of the lessons you draw from that is, in today's very complicated world, maybe it's not such a bad thing to pursue those issues. So that's why I think a focus on diplomacy backed up by the potential use of force and all other kinds of economic leverage aimed at non-proliferation issues is really, really important, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or Iran or any place else.
Let's take a few from the back. I see a hand right here. Yep, gentleman in, looks like blue.
How does someone like John Bolton, as a real hawk, fit into an administration that says, it really wants to focus internally, it doesn't want to engage in war abroad, and he's there saying, let's, annihilate them?
I think Trump liked the way he looked on Fox News. He
minus the mustache.
Yeah, he didn't like the mustache, but the mustache was non-negotiable. Trump likes tough guys. He likes generals. He likes dictators. He clearly has a soft spot for authoritarian types. And he despises prime ministers. He seems to have contempt for elected democratic leaders like Justin Trudeau. He seems to feel that there's something weak about them because they rely on parliaments and the rule of law and checks and balances on their power. So I think Bolton sounds like the kind of man that Trump wants to have speaking out on foreign policy. It's just that Trump, and this is something we really need to try to figure out, does not want to get into a war, at least by every sign that we've seen so far. If Trump wanted to get into wars, and that's just a quirk of personality, we're talking about just a 15-degree turn in character, and this is something I was struck by over and over in writing about Richard Holbrooke, how much foreign policy comes down to human character, and how often the public may think, they've got reams of information and they're going through all of it and coming to a decision. It may be the wrong one, but it's this methodical process. Sometimes, but as Holbrooke once said in his diary, we usually have no more than 2% of the information we need to make a crucial decision at any one time, and the rest is character. So if Trump happened to be the kind of authoritarian, loving man who actually liked a fight, we would be in a war by now. That's all that's holding us back at the moment, because certainly John Bolton wants one.
What is either of your sense in terms of how much influence John Bolton is exerting versus anyone else? I mean, this is the great Washington parlor game, trying to figure out who has the president's ear. But I haven't heard anybody suggesting it was John Bolton who walked back the missile strikes on Iran.
I mean, there's two excellent profiles of him in recent months, one by Graham Wood in our own Atlantic, and the other by my dear friend Dexter Filkins in the New Yorker, and neither of them really gets close to what it's like in the room when Trump and Bolton are talking, whether Trump is exasperated, as he apparently was so often with Bolton's predecessor, H.R. McMaster, because McMaster would go on too long and would give him too much detail, or whether Trump enjoys the Bolton show, but sees it as a show and not as a directive. I don't think we know.
No, and the only thing I'd add is that, in my experience, and I worked a couple of times in government with John Bolton, I would never underestimate his bureaucratic agility. I mean, you're in an administration right now that's filled with lots of acting people, including in the Defense Department right now, and he's kind of, in some respects, monopolized what's called the interagency process, the process that usually exists at administrations to help sort through decisions and then implement them afterwards. And so I wouldn't underestimate his capacity to sort of manage, control, manipulate that process.
And interestingly, usually there is tension, if not outright conflict, between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. I mean, ever since the 60s, since Kissinger, that's been the source of internal friction in foreign policy making between the White House and the State Department. Usually the White House has won that battle, and the National Security Advisor has gained more and more power over the last few decades at the expense of the Secretary of State, which is another reason why diplomacy has fallen to some decline. But here we have a hawk at the National Security Council and a hawk at the State Department. So a once-in-a-century event. The two officials who usually are at war are in agreement. So again, about war. All that stands
And there's no one at the
between them
Pentagon,
is,
so
and
that's
there's no one at
a
the
different conversation. All right, we have time for one more. Yes, sir.
This is for the ambassador. Among the this has to do with the 2020 Democratic candidates. Among the field of candidates, there aren't that many that have significant, if any, foreign policy experience. How and mindful that President Obama didn't really have much in the way of foreign policy experience. How important do you see that in this coming election at this particular time for what's going on globally?
I think it does matter. I think there's no substitute, as George was saying, for character and for judgment, and no amount of experience or expertise can substitute for that. But I think, having a sense of, of America's role in the world and, what's come before, an experience of working with other countries is a big asset for the United States in today's era. At a time of transformation on the international landscape, that helps anchor your policy judgments in reality, because the sense of history is really important too. So, no, I think it's a considerable asset to have that. As I said, judgment and character probably matter most of all, but I think if you can combine those with that experience, it's a pretty formidable combination.
I mean, it's a very interesting election. It's a good question because the Democrats aren't talking about foreign policy. I think 3 of them have given speeches on the subject: Sanders, Warren, and Buttigieg. Maybe 2 very minor candidates whose names I don't remember because there's too many of them. But basically, it's a non-issue at the moment. It's not the thing that's animating them, that's dividing them, that's energizing their crowds. Eventually, it will have to be, because it always is. And my question is whether the Democratic voting base wants a return to essentially the continuity that came from Bush 1, Clinton, I think Bush 2 was a deviation, Obama, Hillary Clinton would have continued as well, which you could call a form of liberal internationalism, where we are pursuing our own interests while trying to create structures and alliances that allow others to benefit from our own leadership, or whether Democratic voters want us to withdraw as a power, to scale back, to stop thinking we need to be involved in everything, and to essentially turn our back on the world, not in the way that Trump's voters want to, with walls and tariffs, but simply with maybe massive reductions in defense spending and maybe even in diplomacy. That's, to me, the big question on the Democratic side, but it hasn't been engaged yet because it doesn't seem to be generating interest.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable. I'm sitting here thinking President Trump came to office with no foreign policy experience. Obama didn't, a couple years on foreign relations in the Senate, but very little. George W. Bush came to office with no foreign policy experience. Clinton didn't really care about foreign policy. You have to go back to Bush père to find a president who came to office with some knowledge and expertise,
And
which
maybe
is
by
amazing.
coincidence, he's the hero of Bill Burns' book.
There we go.
I mean, maybe experience actually does serve a purpose.
But I think it's also, especially for the American public now, who when people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington establishment, preach the virtues of disciplined American leadership in the world, most Americans, whatever party they come from, don't need to be persuaded too much about the value of smart American engagement in the world. They understand that's important for America's prosperity, for our security, for a healthier environment. But they're more skeptical about the disciplined part because they've seen too many examples in Iraq 2003, the global financial crisis, a different kind of hubris of indiscipline. So I think, one of the challenges for Democratic candidates and, anybody who's trying to shape American foreign policy is to convey a sense that, they understand the dangers of overreach and the importance of discipline alongside a sense of, what sets the United States apart on the international landscape, what ought to animate, continued smart American engagement in the world, understanding that this is a different era, that you can't turn the clock back to the 1990s, a moment of singular American dominance on the international landscape. We still, as I said before, have a really strong hand to play. But the question is, how are we going to play it? So, somebody who can convey that sense that, character matters, but this is a new era that the United States has to navigate.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to end. So I will let you have the last word, and I will thank our last questioner for a great question, teeing us up for tomorrow night. Thank you.